All right, welcome to the Apps on Cloud Summit and this session, the impact of full stack visibility, application, net performance insight today and tomorrow. Now, today I'm joined here today by by Steve Plotkin and Tom Griffin. Steve, Tom, guys, introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll get started.
Okay, my name is Steve Plotkin. I work in the Network Performance Management Group here at Sev1 Turbonomics Sev1, and I support telemetry, software-defined networking, as well as standard SNMP networking.
Great, Tom.
Cool. Hi, Tom Griffin here. I'm part of the CTO group at Turbonomic, and I work predominantly with customers and partners around, if you like, convergence of solutions. So, as they're using Turbonomic for data center and infrastructure and cloud monitoring and optimization, Sev1 or the NPM on the network side, and then what we're doing is pulling those two solutions, two domains together, as customers converge their infrastructure.
Great.
So that's my role.
Guys, I realized I didn't introduce myself yet. I'm Brian Promise. Also with Turbonomic Sev1, and my background really has been in product management, product marketing areas in the network manageability area. And it really begins, I think, a great place for us to start when we look at full stack visibility is thinking about the history of what it's meant for an IT organization to understand application and network behavior. I mean, if I go back to when I had a little more hair on the head, right? It was a somewhat simple infrastructure for folks to work with, right? Applications ran on a single physical server, right? You had your disk, you had your compute, all there in one box. You could actually pretty much manually trace what the physical connections between the entities that made up, quote, the service to the customer, to the user. But as I think as folks know, the world has evolved, right? Both on network and the application infrastructure and how applications themselves rely upon the infrastructure. So probably a good place to start. Me throw it out there is why full stack visibility today, right? What are some of the changes that we're seeing in the market, and the need to try to bring all these things together? Yeah.
So let me answer that. So the main reason for full stack visibility is complexity, and you've got complexity in multiple dimensions in today's kind of application-centric environments. When we started virtualizing data center environments, we added a layer of complexity. So instead of managing, to your point, Brian, back in the day where it was an issue with an application, I knew that I go to server A, probably power cycle it, and then everything would be good.
Is it plugged in, Tom? Yeah,
exactly, literally. And now what we've got is, as we started to virtualize, it wasn't one physical machine. I've got a cluster of physical machines with hundreds, if not thousands, of virtual machines that are sitting on top of it. So that adds complexity. At the application level, we moved away from client server. Then we had kind of three-tier applications. Today we're talking about, even within our own apps, containerized applications that have hundreds, if not thousands, of microservices that make up the app, again, running across hundreds, if not thousands of VMs across multiple hosts. So you kind of get the picture of just from a technical perspective, the complexity is involved in these environments. So being able to visualize and understand how these things are interrelated becomes really important. So that's kind of the first dimension of the complexity that's involved. The second dimension of the complexity that's involved is organizational. So in most cases, we deal a lot with enterprise organizations. They will typically have a small number of infrastructure teams. So I have a network infrastructure team. I have a data center infrastructure team, which typically includes the virtualized environment. I might have a Windows and a Linux, kind of teams, but it's a relatively small number. 5 to 10 different teams that are responsible for the entire infrastructure, and what they're doing is they're serving the application owners, whether it's developers, application admins, application operations. They don't have a small number of teams. They have a lot of teams because each enterprise application will typically be managed by a group of people that are managing the life cycle of that application. So then, the organizational is complex, because if I'm the network infrastructure team, for example, I'm serving, my colleagues in the data center and Windows Linux environment, but then in turn, I'm also serving the 100 application teams that are out there. And that,
Yeah,
and it's
I'll say that then, and then I'll say to compound upon that, Tom.
Yeah.
As the applications have become more and more the center of business.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It is, you then have the visibility across the entire business, of, if this stuff isn't working, right, there's heck to pay around it, right? And it makes
very much so. I mean, we've all had the experience of, we're about to join a customer call and it gets pulled at the last minute because the customer has been pulled into a war room. And in that situation, it's typically, these days, certainly, it's not an infrastructure problem. It's not like the network went down, right? That doesn't happen anymore. What typically happens is this application is having an issue, and it could be, particularly in recent times, where we've seen some of our customers in a retail environment where their utilization of their online presence went from being 10% of their business to being 100% of their business pretty much overnight.
Mm-hmm.
They had to, we've seen that, the entire team get pulled into a war room. We need to resolve this situation. We need to reconfigure to meet this demand. So again, that's, the point where being able to visualize and understand how all of these very complex things are interconnected becomes really important. So that's kind of the second tier of the complexity around this. And then the third aspect, and final one, but actually probably the most challenging one, is this thing is changing all the time. So it's, what you understood yesterday is not true today. And then these, the salient changes that are happening, or the important changes that are happening, is the move to cloud changes everything. So, Brian, if you think back to, the start point of this, where not only was a single physical server,
you're talking about when I had hair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, right. Just make sure I get the
You
time.
walk into the room.
You could walk into the server room and it was that box. You move to the cloud, where is it? I don't know. It's on GCP or AWS or Azure. I've given away a little bit of control. There's a lot of benefits in cloud. I mean, huge benefits in cloud, but I've less visibility, I've less control over the infrastructure relationships. If you add on top of that this move to cloud native using, containers, microservices, that becomes, so it's not an application sitting on cloud. It's an application sitting in the cloud that has 100 different components across different cloud services. But the interesting thing is that we're observing, though, as organization moves to the cloud, is that network becomes more important, both from a enterprise to cloud connectivity standpoint. Most people think of it's just the internet. If you're a large enterprise, it's not just the internet. You have dedicated connections into your cloud providers. You have multiple dedicated connections into your cloud providers, with fully secured and fully managed, because they're become pretty bloody important if you think about it. But then also, your user connectivity, your customer connectivity becomes really important. What is your customer's experience to your application if they're over a 3G connection versus a high-speed broadband connection? So being able to understand that, so that, again, going back to the application owners can architect the applications with that in mind. But it all starts with, do I have an understanding and visibility of that entire delivery stack from bare metal right up to the application?
Yeah, and one thing as you were talking about, Tom, things don't always, things aren't just about things going down, right? Yeah. It really is about the application experience that the internal user, the customer, in this case, you're talking about the online presence that they're having. It's really that, slows the new down, whether it's whether it's whether it's the ability to be patient, or just you're expecting things to work, right? Yeah. As we I don't have my phone in my hand, but you can imagine it, right? After a few seconds, you're like, well, what's wrong with this site? I'll go somewhere else. I can go get this, I can go buy these golf clubs at another, at another site, type of approach.
Very much so. And I mean, it's interesting. It's one of the things that I've seen. even inside, working for a vendor, probably over the last 2 years or so is the focus on user experience. Back in the day, you would build an application. This is the way I think it should be, and you ship it out to customers. We spend a huge amount of time now with customers understanding what is your experience of the service, of the product. How can we make it better?
Right.
But navigation, that's a relatively new. I mean, UX has been around forever, but the level of focus on it, that's been driven by, I think the cloud experience is a relatively new phenomenon.
And, I think as you mentioned that, Tom, it's about the experience of the application and the experience of the application that you're trying to manage in the entire stack, but then the experience then of what it means to understand the current state, and history as you go back and look at forensic types of troubleshooting type of scenarios. It's the experience that a user has in their ability then to I'll say get to the insight that's required.
Yep.
And then, as you mentioned, really share it across teams, right? Because it becomes a multiple team, type of approach. Tom, let me throw this question to you on the application infrastructure. We've talked a bit about some of the changes in there. From a technology perspective of how Turbonomic looks at it, how does Turbonomic approach the app infrastructure and keeping ahead of the change, right? And knowing about the changes. What's any not to quote this, it might be secret sauce, but you get the idea of what I'm looking at here.
Yeah. No, so what Turbonomic is doing, I guess, ultimately what Turbonomic does is balance three things. It's, I need to provide a performance solution at an appropriate cost while staying in compliance with whatever policies are in place. So it's doing that balancing act, because the easy thing to do, if you want optimum performance, just over provision everything. Just give it more CPU. What the heck? As organizations have found out, you do that in the cloud, you're in for a nasty shock, because all of a sudden you realize that your cloud bill is way more than you were spending on-prem. So you have to kind of optimize, but you have to optimize in the context of performance. What makes Turbo different? I mean, Turbo's collecting performance stats from storage platforms, physical servers, virtual machines, up and down the stack. So it's collecting all of this performance data and utilization data from pretty much the full stack, or we term the supply chain. But then what it does differently is, instead of just providing you with visibility of how things are performing, or threshold alarms, what it's generating is actionable information. And by actionable information, I mean Turbo can actually take the action for you if required. So what it'll say, for example, is, this virtual machine is over provisioned. It's been running at 20% CPU for the last 6 weeks. But rather than just tell you it's over provisioned, what it'll say is the recommendation is you reduce the number of CPUs on it. Conversely, it can also say this application is resource starved. So I'm seeing, increasing response time on the app. I'm looking at the infrastructure, and there's some kind of pinch point in the infrastructure. The recommendation may be you need to move this virtual machine onto a different part of the infrastructure that has higher bandwidth network connectivity, or better access to storage, or whatever it is. So that's the big difference that it's doing. Is it's not just here's the threshold, you figure out what to do. It's actually saying this is what you should do. And then what we've been working on more recently is that's fantastic for real-time visibility. But what customers are asking for is, I want to be able to see historically how I've been performing. So take that really rich data set, but allow me to go back and see what was my situation like a year ago. How am I comparing quarter on quarter? Those type of queries.
That's device by device, or is there knowledge, Tom, of how things are connected?
There's a lot of knowledge of how things are connected, and so typically it's not device by device. Typically, the way the customer lens on this tends to be an application or a service, or some higher order construct as a start point, and then Turbo's figured out that for this application, these are all the moving parts underneath it. So the customer doesn't need to, they're not looking at a spreadsheet and trying to figure out which server I need to go to. They go, here's my app, right? What does it look? What does it look like today? What did it look like last week? So
I mean, I think a point that as I was talking about, quote, a device, right? What you've been talking through, it's it's not about a device at all, right?
No.
Yes, there are devices and there are services, but it actually makes up that entire supply chain, right? And being able to, be able to have the supply chain knowledge in real time to take actions, it's critical for keeping performance, and assuring performance. That's been a core of Turbonomic through it, I'll say from its inception. But it's now as you then get into the areas around looking back in time and having that same context just helps on that full stack visibility, right? Capability.
And I should point out, so I've spoken a lot about kind of data center type infrastructure because that's where that's the bit that tends to be closest to the application. But everything I've mentioned is equally true of networks. So in the network domain, we're starting to virtualize. It gone are the days where you had, a physical router with a cable. Well, you still have the physical box with the cable, but the connectivity plane is virtualized. So
Well,
and
Steve,
it's
I was
application.
going to say, it makes me think. Steve, I know we've talked, in the past about the impact of network, but tell me about some of the changes that you're seeing take place in the network that have impact on performance visibility.
Well, it's an exciting time for network infrastructure and network performance because it's evolving to points where we've always talked about it. So network infrastructure is being software delivered, like software-defined networking, which is now part and parcel of being configured to the application's demand versus just connecting everything. SD-WAN. These are software-defined wide area networks that provide prioritization to those application services and the application performance so that you're now looking at a much broader and holistic view of what's going on with the application. Is it getting the right priorities to be utilized? Is there issues going in? Do I have that redundancy? All based off of software, as well as, maintaining the traditional devices. So we wind up with that hybrid. It's a hybrid environment, but not necessarily hybrid cloud environment, but a hybrid environment, as well as telemetry as now being able to receive data in a much higher frequency to be able to do some additional analytics more detailed, and then bringing all of that information into the same platform is giving the enterprise that holistic view that they've always worked to achieve, to where I have all my data in one spot, whether it be application or network. I'm able to look at all of those performance statistics. I can analyze the data. I can have server admins look at server specific data, applications looking at application, network infrastructure people or network engineers looking at network infrastructure as it's related to not only their individual areas, but as a holistic enterprise view. So I can look at that application, which has always been that gold standard. I can look at that application and I can look at all of the infrastructure around that application.
There's a few threads we can pull on here, Steve, as you're talking through. I think the first is really ties back to one of the points Tom was making earlier, right? Is that the evolution in networking isn't about the router, isn't about the device, right? It's about the application driving the proper behavior of the network to make sure that that the network is providing the service that the infrastructure and the applications need to make it work. That's a key distinction.
It's the same as if, when we talk about applications in the beginning, we knew the server room it was in, we'd go up to the physical device. Now with a software-defined network infrastructure, where's that device? It's not in a communications closet anymore. It's software defined. So it really makes just that connectivity or that connection. And at the end result, you're looking at a wire closet, not, racks of equipment. So, and rightly so, you shouldn't really care about it, because if your provider, us, are looking at those performance metrics from a single source of information and truth, you then can manage your enterprise in a much more effective manner.
The other thing that's add to that, Steve, it's the other aspect of kind of software defined is the level of control and which then drives the rate of change. So back in the old days, if you wanted to make a network-wide configuration change, for example, I want to prioritize a new application, you'd have to touch hundreds of individual boxes and change the config. And we've all seen it. So you're bound to get a percentage of them wrong, but whereas with software defined, I can go to a central console and change the policy or the configuration of my network environment to prioritize that application based on changing demand. So there's a level of control that didn't exist previously. But that, again, going back to the kind of this visibility question, is that means that the rate of change is inherently greater, because if I can reprioritize an application based on changing demand, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to get much better at identifying changing demand, where in the past, I wouldn't even consider doing that because it was just too hard, So from a monitoring standpoint, then that adds another level of complexity. So
yeah, especially we mentioned that I think about some of the arc of network performance monitoring, right? Network performance monitoring used to come after the device was provisioned. You would then take it to the, we go to the monitoring team. Okay, here's your IP address here, and go start gathering your SNMP stats. But now you're in a world where it's evolved, where the management platforms, like we have here at Turbonomic, tap directly into these control systems. They know about what's new, what's different, and automatically then providing that visibility in real time and over time to the data sets and understanding the relationships at the network level.
And the other piece of that is on the infrastructure. 5 minutes is a long time to kind of wait for a poll to take place to get your metric data to find out if you do have a performance issue or not. Whereas now we're looking at a much higher density of data, much more data, because our platforms, Turbonomic's platform can support more data being received. So in the network side of it, from a telemetry perspective and receiving software telemetry data versus polling it, we get it at 10-second intervals. So visibility is much higher.
I said, if we always take ourselves back to why are we monitoring the network, it's because of the applications that sit above it. Right. And if the patience level to wait, 5 minutes, it's just not going to cut in a modern application hosting environment. So that need for, it's really this value of telemetry as it evolves from folks like Cisco, Arista, Juniper, right? Delivering this type of telemetry. It then brings that other thread challenge that you mentioned, Steve, is that yes, networks are evolving, right? Much like application infrastructure is evolving, but you need to see it as an entire system, right? And the ability to bring the world of, say, the old SNMP world in with streaming and be able to see those things together becomes that much more important.
Right. The single view, the single pane, or the single source of all of your data is critical to moving forward in this in technology today. It's as simple as that. You cannot go to sum up one machine for some pieces of data and another machine for other pieces of data, and then try to stitch it together into a view. So you're absolutely.
I'll say it's much like what we're showing here, right? If you think about the discussion we've been on today, right? Tom was talking about the having that application view at the top and the need to gather performance data all the way through an application infrastructure stack. Steve, you were talking about the impact of the evolving network technologies, whether it would be the edge, the data center, the core of the network. And then Tom, you were talking about the need to know how all these things stitch together, right? You talked about the supply chain. That's really over here on the left-hand side, and it is and it's anchored in something, Tom, you said, right? It's anchored in performance.
Yeah.
How is this supply chain for that application at the top of the stack and its app infrastructure and the network components that it relies upon? How are they performing now? Well, if there was an issue the other day, what happened back then, right? And think about some of the use cases that can come out of this, right? There's use cases on, of course, on real-time change that can take place. There are use cases that get into, what happened, say incident forensic types of use cases. I could see getting into capacity planning on the network side of things, make sure that you know that, hey, what happened last year when we were going through a big sales rush, right? What was the network doing at that point in time, and being able to project around it. But what are Steve, tell what other use cases you guys seen around the around the space?
So we talk about in general 2020 and the big changes there. So the shift of application and the importance of the reliability of my applications, especially online transactional applications, went from 0 to 100 in literally 1 month. If you remember being based in quarantine, from a network infrastructure perspective and supporting that enterprise, we went from working in offices, hardwired desktops, and to working from home and going through all of these remote connections, which, changed the dynamics of how enterprises were prepared for it, which, luckily we were able to demonstrate to companies from both an application and a network. I'll let Tom talk about it from a application side, but from a network side, they had to really be able to modify their VPN devices, their security devices, their input load balances, to be able to manage the significant change in load from everybody or a small amount of people working remotely or a small amount of people doing online transactions to nobody is going into retail, no one is working in an office. So it was significant, and being able to see it, adjust it on the fly, and monitor it from an infrastructure perspective was key to the success of those that were that had the tools in place. And Tom, I'm pretty sure you could talk about it from an application perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, the two things, I guess, Brian, go back to your question. The emerging use case is very much capacity planning. And when I say capacity planning, I don't mean capacity planning, in the way that we did it, back in the day. Capacity planning is not something that you do every 6 months or once a year. What we're seeing organizations now move to is capacity planning in its broadest sense and on an ongoing basis. So you're constantly looking at and it tends to be, I think one of the things we learned from the pandemic was the whole idea of forward planning, kind of going, well, we think we'll grow 10% next year, therefore this is going to happen. That got thrown out the window. To the point of like VDI. I had one customer that said our VDI estate generally ran at 2% utilization. It went from 2% to 100% in 4 hours, and stayed at 100%. While our service desk were getting calls from users, their own internal users, saying, I can't get access, I can't work. So, capacity planning becomes very real time in that domain, in that context. But the other thing that's happening is as organizations migrate apps into the cloud, which is happening, it's, we know what's happening. There's two aspects to that. One is my on-prem infrastructure starts to scale down. So I start to, I can remove capacity both from the, on-prem data centers, also from network as well. And the other shift we're seeing there is moving away from physical wired connections to Wi-Fi. So I can start to retire a lot of my on-prem infrastructure. And as I'm growing my cloud infrastructure, but I'm also starting to grow the amount of network traffic that's going to the cloud, it starts to increase. So it becomes increasingly important to start to
it's a shift in the value of the network edge, right, on that side.
Absolutely.
So,
I was going
to say one thing that I really like about this topic is I think we could talk for a long time, right?
Absolutely.
There are so many examples that we could go through, but I realize we're getting up to our time period here as part of the session. But I want to let everyone know, if folks have any questions about what we've been talking about, please jump into the chat. We're happy to answer anything along that side, or reach out to us at turbonomic.com. We'll be sure to help get back to you. But Steve, Tom, thanks for your time today, and look forward to future conversations on the impact of full stack visibility. So appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
Cool.